Okay. Well, welcome on behalf of the University of Maryland's Graduate Program in Historic Preservation and the entire faculty of the School of Architecture, Preservation, and Planning. I would like to welcome you this evening to the Spring 2015 Marvin Breckinridge Patterson Lecture. It's a pleasure to be here with you this evening, and let me begin by welcoming our speaker, Mr. Tom Mays, back to the University of Maryland. And we really look forward to his presentation tonight and learning about why old places matter. The Marvin Breckinridge Patterson Lecture was established through a generous gift from Mrs. Patterson in 1998, actually after you started teaching here, to support an annual public lecture on historic preservation. Born of privilege, Mrs. Patterson dropped her given name of Mary, and under the name of Marvin Breckinridge, she studied photography, cinematography, and journalism in the early part of the 20th century. Interestingly, her cousin was also named Mary Breckinridge, and she was the founder of the Frontier Nursing Service, which was the subject of Mrs. Patterson's very first and highly acclaimed silent movie in 1930. So she was quite an individual. Marvin Patterson eventually worked as a freelance photojournalist and CBS broadcaster in Europe during World War II. Hired by Edward R. Murrow, she was one of the first women correspondents to cover the war. In 1940, she married a Foreign Service officer named Jefferson Patterson, but had to end her career in journalism due to State Department restrictions on wives working while their husbands were in service. In addition to endowing our lecture, Mrs. Patterson is also known across the state of Maryland for her generous gift of the Jefferson Patterson Park, which we enjoy in many ways with students and faculty today. Before introducing our speaker, I'd just like to thank a couple of people. First, David Fogel, our founder, who really helped establish this lecture series and was with us when Tom started teaching with us. Chris Hinojosa, who was responsible for coordinating the publicity for tonight's event. And finally, Ruth Davis Rogers, our dynamic HISP administrative assistant, who has really supported and made this event possible. Tonight's speaker, Tom Mays, is an old friend to the HISP program and former lecturer at Maryland, having taught our preservation law class here for some 15 years. Tom is currently the Deputy General Counsel for the National Trust for Historic Preservation in Washington and has specialized in corporate and preservation law since he joined the National Trust in 1986. He is the author of many articles related to and has lectured widely on preservation easements, shipwreck protection, historic house museums, the Americans with Disabilities Act, preservation public policy, and the importance of old places. A recipient of the Rome Prize in Historic Preservation from the American Academy in Rome, Mr. Mays authored a recent series of essays titled Why Old Places Matter that really, I think, formed the gist of what we'll be hearing about tonight. Tom received his BA in honors in history with honors in 1981 and his JD in 1985 from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and an MA in fiction writing from the Johns Hopkins University. Tom chaired a great session on why old places matter at this year's National Trust Conference in Savannah, and having seen that presentation, I knew we had to really get him out here to talk about this with us tonight. So without further ado, please join me in a warm Maryland welcome for Tom Mays.
Can you all hear me well enough?
Yes.
Thank you, Don. I really appreciate that. You're a wonderful old friend, as I consider the entire HISP program to be. I'm delighted and honored to be back here, and I very much wanted to thank you for inviting me to speak. I want to say that as I taught here for 15 years, I very much still miss the interactions with the students and the faculty that I had, and that dynamic intersection of teaching and learning, where I felt like I learned as much from the students about what preservation law was as they learned from me. So thank you. I miss it, and I'm happy and delighted to be back. I'm also deeply honored to deliver the Marvin Breckenridge Patterson Lecture. Marvin Breckenridge Patterson, who the Trust we knew as Mrs. Patterson, was not only an astonishingly accomplished person, but also a major donor to the National Trust. Ambassador Mrs. Patterson gave major gifts of decorative arts, books, papers, and other materials over more than a decade, from 1974 to 1985. The donations found homes at Decatur House on Lafayette Square, the Woodrow Wilson House, home of Woodrow Wilson, and Lyndhurst, the home of Jake Gould, among other National Trust historic sites. Overall, Ambassador and Mrs. Patterson donated close to 500 objects, making them one of our largest donors who did not give an entire house to the National Trust. The National Trust continues to benefit from their generosity, and we're grateful. Now, I'm thrilled to be able to talk about a topic that I worked on thanks to the National Trust and to the American Academy in Rome. I think it's a topic that most of you also care deeply about. Why do old places matter? What difference does it make? What difference does it make if we use them, reuse them, or if we don't? How is it beneficial for people? So before I jump into that topic, I wanted to share with you all a little bit about where I started. For 6 months last year, as Donna said, I was at the American Academy in Rome on sabbatical, working on this project. How did I come up with this idea, and why did I think it was important? Or to quote somebody who recently posted something online, kind of crazy that we even have to think about why old places matter. Well, the root of it really begins here at the University of Maryland. In my preservation law class, as many of my former students who are here tonight will remember, I would begin by a discussion about why we have preservation law. Why should we be telling people what to do with their property? How does protection of cultural resources stack up against other societal values as compared to property rights, as compared to free exercise of religion, as to environmental rights, to clean air and clean water? Where does the protection of our cultural resources weigh in with that? And what I discovered is that even graduate students in historic preservation, as well as other people, often did not have ready answers for why we have preservation law, much less why we have preservation at all. The conversation often morphed into why we have preservation at all. So let me say this question was not limited to the students at the University of Maryland. I also gave guest lectures at Columbia, Penn, and talked to preservation professionals throughout the country. Most of them did not have ready elevator speeches for why old places mattered to them. At the same time, I wrote a chapter in this book of Richer Heritage. The chapter was on preservation law and public policy. Some of you, I know, have read it. And the basic theme of that chapter was that until we had a broader ethic of historic preservation, we were unlikely to have stronger laws or policies. That the laws and policies, in fact, might even be stronger than the underlying ethic would lead one to believe. And it seemed to me that it was critically important for us to develop an ethic by first being able to articulate why old places actually matter to people. So I began to look around for the statements of why old places matter. And what I found is that the statements were often very limited in scope. They often reiterated the few purposes that were in place in our statutes. They often were on State Historic Preservation Office websites. And they were often brief, not written in evocative language. and they really hadn't been re-examined since 1965 with the publication of this book, which remains a sort of key document for historic preservation with heritage so rich, which came up with that beautiful phrase, a sense of orientation. We preserve to provide a sense of orientation for people. Well, what does that mean? So I proposed this project to the American Academy Room. This is the Academy building on the Janiculum Hill, designed by McKim, Mead, and White, purchased by J.P. Morgan for the Academy. I proposed a project to go to Rome and try to explore this idea. Why do old places really matter to people? And the rationale for being in Rome, because I had to have a rationale in order to go, was that I would be able to interview people there in the Academy, a wide variety of people, as well as do reading in their libraries and in the EPROM library. So I set about doing this process by interviewing people outside the preservation field and inside the preservation field. So you see some of them illustrated here. Curators, archaeologists, poets, writers, a few preservationists, landscape designers, architects, professors, developers, students. I tried to interview a very broad range of people. I also did lots of reading to try to just gather together all these reasons and see if I could see what people most thought resonated. And you'll see in the upper left-hand corner, there's a woman under this sort of shelter. That's Dr. Kim Bowes from the University of Pennsylvania, who is now the director of the American Academy in Rome, explaining the history of the preservation of the hut of Romulus during the reign of Caesar Augustus, which struck me as a sort of origin story for preservation. That preservation is a very long impulse that has been carried through Western civilization, at least. So then I turned to trying to shape this project. And I'm showing this introduction page because what it resulted in was a series of essays published as conversation starters through the Preservation Leadership blog of the National Trust. And the real purpose of these was not so much to be the definitive answer on each of these topics, nor an academic piece of study, but to serve as conversation starters to get these ideas out into the world and to try to get people to pay attention to them and think about them. One word about terminology. I keep saying old places. I very consciously chose the term old places because I wanted to capture all the places that people cared about that may not necessarily fall within our definition of historic resource or something listed in the National Register. I wanted to capture parks, I wanted to capture cemeteries, I wanted to capture squares, I wanted to capture any of these old places that people care about, regardless of whether they meet our criteria for designation. Let me say at the outset that I don't think there is a set number of reasons for why old places matter. I think there are many reasons, and at any one place there may be multiple reasons layered on top of each other. People may respond to places differently, so a reason may resonate with someone at one place but not with another person at that same place. So there are many reasons. What I did was come up with a series of essays on the words I heard most frequently or that I felt needed to be addressed. So with that, I'm going to jump into the reasons that I wrote about. Keep in mind that they're not necessarily the only ones. And as I go through this presentation, please be thinking to yourself, why do old places matter to me? Why does this place matter? How would I I articulate how it matters. And I'll come back to that at the very end, and hopefully we'll have a conversation. So, that being said, one of the words I heard most frequently is the word continuity. Old places give people a sense of continuity. In a world that's constantly changing, old places give people a sense of being part of a continuum that is necessary for them to be psychologically and emotionally happy. Maria Lewicka, an environmental psychologist, wrote that the majority of authors agree that development of emotional bonds with places is a prerequisite of psychological balance and good adjustment, and that it helps to overcome identity crises and give people the sense of stability they need in the ever-changing world. One of the most common places where we see continuity is school buildings. I was just talking to Brent Leggs about this school. This is actually in the upper right-hand corner, is a school that looks like a Rosenwald school, but it's not. It was built for white students. It's where my father went to elementary school. Schools provide people within a community with a sense of continuity, and they often feel it very strongly when they return to the place where they went to school. This sense of continuity can perhaps be understood most forcefully when it's broken, when people are forcibly removed from places. The chapel you see here is a place called Palmer Chapel in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And it is a place where generations after their families were removed to form the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, people still come back there for reunions. The sense of the break of identity with that place is so strong that even generations later people come back. This happens all over the world. On the right-hand side, you see the city of Matera in Italy, where people were removed from the Sassi, this area of what were considered cave dwellings, because it wasn't considered sanitary or helpful housing. Again, the people I met with there, generations later, still talk about how that break with that place, the community was never the same. They were never the same. Their identity was destroyed. Old places give people a sense of continuity in an ever-changing world. Next word, memory. Old places help us remember. The architect Mary Grenadei tells her granddaughter, old buildings are like memories you can touch. Memory is an essential part of consciousness. Without memory, we're hardly ourselves. And we see this when we, in the way we react to people who have Alzheimer's or for some other reason have lost their memory. Their identity is partially erased as a result of it. And there is, as the geographers Stephen Fulcher and Derek Alderman say, an inextricable link between memory and place. People anchor their divergent memories in place. There are two different aspects to this. Individual memory, and here I use the example of the Cafe Reggio, a cafe in Greenwich Village that I frequented in my 20s when I was living in New York, and which I go back to. And when I go back to it, I can measure how I have changed since I went there in my 20s, the sense of individual memory. And collective memory. Collective memory is illustrated here by both the battlefield, often places where many people have memories of that event, and the March on Washington, the reflecting pool at the March on Washington. This sense of collective memory is something that often grows out of multiple individual memories experienced at the same place. People argue about collective memory. Many of the critics of preservation often talk about this. Whose memory and for what purpose? Fulcher and Alderman again. Whether one refers to collective memory, social memory, public memory, historical memory, popular memory, or cultural memory, people look to this refashioned memory, especially in its collective forms, to give themselves a coherent identity, a national narrative, a place in the world. But the key point that's interesting to me is that no matter how people interpret and reinterpret that memory, It's the place that transcends that multiple interpretation. The place is the vortex, the common ground, the center point, and the focus, where divergent views about memory can be felt and expressed. Old places serve as mnemonic aids that trigger memory and allow people to measure themselves and assess their lives. Excuse me. Memories will survive without the place. And that's one of the conclusions I reached. Memories can survive without the place, but they will not prove as durable nor as flexible when the vortex of memory, that mnemonic aid, the place, is gone. Individual identity. Let me say that these first three or four clusters of words are interrelated and interact together. Old places embody our identity. People have long recognized the link between place and identity, from Cicero, who wrote of returning to his grandfather's house, to James Marston Fitch, who wrote that preservation affords the opportunity for the citizens to regain a sense of identity with their own origins, of which they have often been robbed by the sheer process of urbanization. Psychologists, sociologists, philosophers, and architectural theorists all study the relationship between place and identity. Most would agree that place is inextricably linked with the development and maintenance of continuity of self. There are those that even theorize that identity and place are inseparable, that people are always in and of place, that life itself begins and ends with place. That's one of the reasons that one of the first things we ask about someone when we meet them is, where are you from? Because getting the answer to where they're from often tells us more about a person than almost any other thing can. Now, one of the things that I wanted to note, however, is that our sense of identity with place is not static. It changes over time. So what you see in the upper left corner is the church where I grew up, this little country Presbyterian church in Piedmont, North Carolina, where my family had gone for generations. My identity is very tied to that place. The tombstone in the foreground says Mays. It is my last name. I'm very tied to that place. On the right hand is this plain farmhouse where my great-grandfather lived, very much associated with my identity, that place. And yet, my identity has also changed over time. I was just talking with Don and others about the fact that when I drove back up here and came into this building, because I taught here for 15 years, I was immediately struck by, oh my gosh, this place actually is embedded in me also. This place is part of my identity. Same is true for the American Academy in Rome building. But one of the striking things that I discovered through this exploration is that it often takes only one generation for a place to have a sense of individual identity associated with it. In the lower corner, you see the sign from Eastland Mall in the east side of Charlotte, North Carolina. While I was in Rome, much to my surprise, this was proposed to be demolished, and a local preservation group went through a long-term project to try to save it. And they saved it using the same language, they tried to save it using the same language I was using, about identity, about memory, about it being the identity of Charlotte. And in fact, the demolition company that was hired to tear it down actually set up a memory site where people could post their memories of Eastland Mall, even though this place was only 40 years old. Turned out the demolition contractor had met his wife ice skating at the mall. These places can actually begin to collect our identities in only one generation, in only a few years. Civic identity. That was about individual identity. Now we turn to civic identity. Old places embody our civic, state, national, and universal identity. Independence Hall, shown here in the upper photograph, and countless other places embody the history and principles of the United States. The preservation movement has long championed these places. and patriotism and national identity have been key drivers of the preservation movement throughout its history. They still are, to some degree. But I noted when I talked to people about this idea that we no longer felt very comfortable talking about patriotism as a reason to save old places. A reticence that reflects what Edward Said described as the vexed issue of nationalism and national identity, of how memories of the past are shaped in accordance with a certain notion of we, or for that matter, who they really are. We've left people out. Slaves were not mentioned at plantation houses. Native Americans were treated as enemies. And countless workers and everyday people were also not acknowledged as places throughout the country. National identity can also be manipulated. Here's a building on the right, known as the Square Coliseum, constructed by Mussolini. And Mussolini very consciously tried to draw a connection between his regime and the empire of Augustus. He built it specifically to do that. On the left is a map of Africa that was recently unveiled, recovered in a building designed by Luigi Moretti, which shows the fascist victories in Africa. But the thing about old places that's interesting to me is that the continued presence of the old places permits and may even foster the acknowledgement of changed identities and the transformation of identity over time. Like the way slavery is now acknowledged at Monticello and Mount Vernon, and the way people are now advocating for Italians to acknowledge the fascist past through places like these. Old places may even lead to social justice because of their continued existence, as explored by Professor Max Page in an upcoming forum article. There are also places that form part of our universal identity. And here we show the Bamayan Buddhas. Our very identity as humans. We felt that sense of universal identity when those Buddhas were destroyed, and most recently in the places that have been destroyed by ISIS. These are parts of our world that belong to all of us. They're part of our human identity. Old places are part of our collective identity. Old places are beautiful. Not always, but often. If you Google beautiful places, you'll come up with a list of natural places and old places with only the smallest smattering of new places. Beauty and the threat to beautiful places was the driving force for many early preservation efforts, and beauty remains at the heart of why many people care about old places. We all know how much harder it is to save an ugly building than a beautiful building. Yet as I talked to people about beauty as a reason, I found that people were reticent to talk about it. And I think that people on preservation commissions and other public fora are also hesitant to make decisions based on beauty, despite the fact that preservation is sometimes called aesthetic regulation. We don't often expressly ground our decisions in the idea of beauty. This is for many reasons. The subjective nature of beauty, the difficulty of defining it, the loaded cultural aspects of beauty, or the fact that it may simply be considered frivolous or expendable. Yet, beauty is still something that delights, moves, and satisfies people. A study by the Commission for Architecture and the Built Environment found that beauty is a deeply positive experience, contributing to happiness and well-being. But here's the thing that's interesting to me. Preservation is the public forum where concepts of beauty change. Preservation has been a march of the ugly transforming into the beautiful. Victorian houses were once considered ugly, even in my lifetime. Art Deco and Moderne were considered hopelessly commercial. Mid-century modern, even brutalism, is just now being appreciated. I think we should learn how to talk about the beauty of old places, the psychological and sociological benefits of beauty, and to demand beauty in our cities, towns, and communities. Old places matter because they are, or because they may become, beautiful. places give us an understanding of history that no other documents or evidence possibly can. How? Old places have the unique ability for people to experience history with all their senses, to tell us different information than documents can tell us. Old places allow us to experience history with a full body immersion. But why should this matter to people? First, history itself is important. We've all heard throughout our lives how difficult it is to teach or understand history. Yet often the most vivid experience of history may be at a historic place. One problem, however, is that the experience of some of those historic places does everything possible to eliminate a full sensory experience. We tell people not to touch instead of to touch. We tell people don't put your hand on the handrail that Lincoln used. The Trust and many other institutions throughout the country are now moving past this narrow view of how to interpret historic sites and trying to return them more to a full body, more dynamic engagement with history. History is important to have an educated citizenry. We can't meaningfully participate in a democratic society without an awareness of history. Earlier, I talked about how history can be manipulated, and I showed the image of Mussolini, the way Mussolini tried to tie his regime to the Augustan Empire. Yet the more vivid our experience of history, the more we can counter that manipulation. Old places matter because they are our history. Architecture. Old places, as architecture, are part of our cultural inheritance. We love old buildings that are architecturally significant because they're part of the cultural legacy of all humankind, and because of how they make us feel. I remember the feeling I had as a child in the old house one of my father's friends used as a barn. It had been built by a master builder and felt all the whole. I didn't know what it was I was experiencing in those tall old rooms. But I later learned it was probably proportion, balance, and harmony, and time. It was architecture. In Renaissance and many neoclassical buildings, like the Villa Rotunda, shown here in the lower left-hand side, we feel the emotional impact of proportion, balance, harmony. At Farnsworth House, shown above that, we feel Mies van der Rohe's attempt to embed a house as much as possible in nature. As a National Trust architect pointed out recently, this is one of the most significant buildings in the history of architecture after the Farnsworth House. Nothing was ever the same in architecture. Architects, designers, all looked at old architecture, the Villa Rotunda or the Farnsworth House, as models and inspiration. And that alone is an important enough reason in its own right, because those are the people who design the places where we live, work, and play every day. But as Juhani Pallasmaa, the architectural theorist and architect, points out in an upcoming issue of Forum Journal, architecture is also important because it places us in the continuum of time, particularly old places. When we see the pyramids, we are immediately placed on the continuum of time and history. Old architecture matters because of the way it makes us feel, because of the artistic legacy it represents, and because of the way it positions us in time. Some old places matter because they're sacred or because they're considered sacred. People all over the world find old places like the sanctuary of Chimayo, shown in the lower slide, lower image. The sanctuary of Chimayo in New Mexico, moving, and actively seek to experience the feelings of sacredness in these and similar places. From the Wailing Wall of Jerusalem to St. Peter's Basilica, to Santiago de Compostela, to the Shrine of Ise in Japan, and Mount Taylor in New Mexico. Sacred places have been revered for thousands of years by many different cultures. The age-old experience of visiting a sacred place remains so meaningful today that millions of people continue the tradition of pilgrimage, traveling to sacred places that also have become tourist destinations. There are other ways, in addition to the religious, that places are considered sacred. sites of conscience are often considered sacred. They've been sanctified by the things that have happened there, like Shockoe Bottom in Richmond, Virginia, which the National Trust and others are currently trying to save because it was one of the largest slaveholding centers in the United States. These places continue to give people a deeply satisfying experience of the sacred. Yet we as preservationists tend to distance ourselves from talking about the sacred. Partly that's because our tools are often regulatory, and as government we have to pay attention to the constitutional separation of church and state. But more generally, in preservation and in thinking about why our places matter, we should again become less reticent in noting that old places actually matter to people because they embody aspects of the sacred. Learning. Old places are places where people learn. It's a traditional function of historic sites throughout the history of preservation, as shown by Old Salem here on the left in North Carolina. Both to learn and to teach. I talked about that a bit with history. But there are also things we learn simply because of the survival of the place. On the right-hand side are two images of the Quantai Temple in Mendocino, California, built in 1854 by Chinese immigrants. As one of the Chinese descendants, shown here, said to us on a visit, what we learned here is something very simple, that we were here. Old places matter because they are unparalleled and irreplaceable places to learn. Creativity. Old places spur creativity. People are inspired by old places to compose, write, and do other creative work. Recent studies show that people's imaginations are actually spurred by old places. Richard Florida wrote that the creative class is drawn to old places. One of the key ingredients of old places, according to him, is authenticity. He says, authenticity, as in real buildings, real people, real history, is key. Although Florida may be the first to talk about that with regard to the creative economy, it's not a new notion. Preservationists throughout their history have been spurred by creativity. In fact, some early aspects of the preservation movement were actually founded by artists, writers, such as the Charleston people at the Charleston Renaissance, who helped start the first preservation ordinance in America. Old places also transmit artistic legacies. The lower image is a place called RCA Studio A in Nashville, Tennessee, which is a place where Elvis recorded, where Dolly Parton recorded Jolene, and which was recently saved through the efforts of the singer-songwriter Ben Folds. He saved it because he wanted it to continue as a place of creativity and to continue that artistic legacy. In addition, it, like many other creative places, often has very specific artistic qualities. Here, the acoustics. The National Preservation Green Lab has been doing studies trying to prove the truth of Jane Jacobs' theories. It's now demonstrated that the power of older, smaller buildings helps spur startups and other aspects of the creative economy. As the American economy increasingly turns toward creative work, the ability of old places to spur creativity may be a continually increasingly important reason to keep and reuse old places. Sustainability. The greenest building is the building that's already built, as the architect Carl Elefanty has famously said. The reuse of existing buildings results in land conservation, habitat preservation, open space preservation, reduced fuel consumption, avoidance of adverse impacts from the extraction and transportation of new materials, avoidance of new landfill material, and also benefits from the positive passive design of existing buildings. In addition, a more conceptual idea is that the building or community that has grown itself organically as part of the environment may itself be considered part of the ecology of the place. I don't think the green values of old buildings have been fully recognized. But I do think that the issue of sustainability, these ideas of avoided impact, embodied energy, carbon footprint, have the greatest capacity right now to fundamentally shift the paradigm about how society views old buildings. Old places matter because using and reusing them is environmentally sustainable. Ancestry. Old places connect us to our ancestors. Making a connection to our ancestors was once an explicit reason that we sought to save old places. But over the decades, preservationists have shied away from talking about this connection. Why? Probably because it was perceived of as being elitist or exclusionary. Yet in recent years, the field of genealogical research has exploded in scale, as witnessed by Ancestry.com and a plethora of television and other programs. The upper image is Somerset Plantation in North Carolina, a North Carolina state historic site that became one of the first southern plantation sites to foster a connection between the site and the descendants of the slaves who once lived and worked at the place. And on the upper right is Trace Atkins, the country musician, who's visiting a Civil War battlefield where his ancestor fought. He serves on the board of the Civil War Trust. Being able to connect with our places where people's ancestors lived and worked gives people a deep sense of satisfaction, a sense of identity and belonging. Old places continue to matter because they connect us to our ancestors. Community. This post just came out yesterday, so for those of you who have been following them, you probably haven't read this one yet. Old places foster community, but how? How do old places, old buildings, old cities and towns foster community? What particular role do old places play? The writer Wendell Berry says, a community is the mental and spiritual condition of knowing that the place is shared. Old places foster community by giving people a sense of shared identity through landmarks, through history, memory, and stories, many of those things that I spoke about earlier. By having the attributes that foster community, such as distinctive character and walkability, and by serving as shared places where people meet and gather. A great example of the way old places foster community is how we experience post offices. I showed the La Jolla post office in California down below. Local post offices, often architecturally distinctive and in the center of town, serve as both meeting places and community landmarks of identity, like this one. For more than 2 decades, planners, academics, preservationists, and everyday people have lamented the way sprawl has destroyed the American landscape, diminished the distinctiveness of place, and eviscerated the vitality of older towns and cities. Essentially, how it has destroyed community. New urbanists promote placemaking, the design of new places, to foster a distinctiveness of place and a sense of community. Developers of new places advertise walkability, design, front porches, alleys, garages behind the houses, open space, squares, and a mix of retail, residential, and workplaces, the very things that many old communities already have. All these are intended to allow people to interact with each other, to avoid getting in their car, and therefore to create the conditions that foster community. I applaud these efforts. Yet something crucially important is missing and is overlooked. And that is the idea that the development of real community takes time. Community develops through the interaction between people and place over time. We cannot build a community. We can only foster the conditions in which communities can grow and thrive. If community is shared experience expressed in terms of a common physical place, old places are crucial. Old places are where people, time, and place intertwine to form community. That's the end of the essays that I have written so far. But the series is not over yet. And the next one that's coming up is going to be on economics. The series will then conclude probably in April with the issue of a forum journal dedicated to this topic of why old places matter, with articles by other writers. So there's going to be an article by Juhani Pallasma about dwelling in time, and an article by Max Page about how old places can foster social justice, and an article by Jeremy Wells about how what's known about the social science behind old places and what's not known and what additional research needs to be done. Even though the series is not over yet, I want to share with you some of the preliminary conclusions that I came to. And these are really just reactions more than conclusions, and I hope we'll have an engaged conversation about these. I'm going to go through just 5 quick reactions to this exploration. First, through this, remember I said that after I wrote that chapter in A Richer Heritage, I was concerned that our laws and policies might actually have a stronger sense of preservation than the underlying ethic had. I no longer think that. I came away from this project actually thinking that old places are more fundamentally important than I thought they were. Although I think many decision makers primarily think of preservation as something nice, my exploration into continuity, memory, and identity, particularly after looking at the fields of place attachment and place identity, suggests that continuity of place is much more important to people than we have fully understood. It is psychologically and emotionally grounding for people. It positions preservation as much more important than I had previously thought. Secondly, the 2 primary reasons most often used to justify preservation, architecture and architecture and history, while important, only support some of the most fundamental reasons that old places matter to people. And they do it as a secondary effect, not necessarily as a primary effect. The fundamental psychological and sociological reasons of continuity, stability, belonging, memory, and identity position old places as critically important for people's well-being, yet most of our preservation tools and policies primarily focus on only those 2 reasons. These 2 reasons, really are important. But what I question is, what are we missing by only focusing on those 2 reasons? What other resources should we be capturing that are critically important to people that are not being captured by our current tools? Third, the world of preservation is a much larger world than I thought it was. It includes other voices from outside the formal preservation field, and I'll note in particular the fields of environmental psychology and the people who study place identity and place attachment, as well as those accidental preservationists who are part of the creative economy and who open businesses, rehab houses, start breweries, record music, start up factories, and do a host of other things in older and historic buildings. I think we should be paying more attention to those voices from outside the preservation field. Fourth, places may be old in only one generation. I talked about Eastland Mall. If continuity, stability, memory, and identity are the key purposes, then it's important to recognize that people can form those attachments in a very short period of time. And I think that raises questions about how we do our current preservation practice, whether we should be questioning the 50-year rule, and whether we should be questioning the sense of the period of significance. And finally, something I've already mentioned, and that's represented by this light well on the right-hand side. Sustainability may be the key paradigm shift that may occur in preservation. If people begin to increasingly recognize how important the reuse of buildings is to the ecology of the world. And if they begin to recognize how green buildings, the reusable buildings actually is, it may fundamentally shift how many places are saved. But it may also call into question some of our practices and how we go about preserving them. And it may question how we apply the Secretary of the Interior standards, for instance. Those are just some of my reactions. Other people will react differently. I will say, I want to leave you with the thought that, that through this exploration of purposes, and again, I don't think this is a limited list, I think there are many others, I've become even more convinced that old places matter deeply to people and to society, and for more reasons than I thought. They're necessary for our psychological and emotional health. They ground us with a sense of belonging. They inspire us in creativity. They soothe us with beauty and sacredness. They help us know who we are. Thank you for your attention this evening. I'm delighted I could share this information with you. I said at the beginning that I intended these essays as conversation starters, that I hope people would think about why old places matter to them as I went through the PowerPoint. Now, I'd love to hear from you all, and I hope we'll have a conversation. Why do you think old places matter? Thank you.